They told you history was written in ink. It wasn't. It was written in silence, sealed beneath courthouse floors, buried under the weight of signatures and shame. And if you listen closely, really listen, you can still hear the echo of a gavel striking wood. The day a man bought a pregnant woman for 12 cents. 12 cents. That sound still vibrates through the bones of this country. The year was 1853, Louisiana. The auction block gleamed under a gray sky. A crowd gathered not for justice, but for property. On the courthouse steps stood a young woman, belly swollen, eyes hollow, chained by law and by bloodline. Her name would vanish from every document, but her price would not. 12 copper coins, counted out slowly, each one ringing like a funeral bell. And here's what they don't tell you. This wasn't an act of desperation. It was an act of domination. The sale was deliberate, designed to humiliate. Because the man who sold her knew she was carrying another master's child. You're not supposed to know that part. You're not supposed to know why the record disappeared, or who ordered it destroyed. But this isn't about a woman, or even about slavery. It's about ownership. Of flesh, of truth, of history itself. It's about men who discovered that control doesn't end when a person dies. It continues when their story is erased. Tonight, you're not just hearing what happened. You're feeling the machinery that still hums behind modern power. The quiet systems that convince you to forget. The transaction of 12 cents was a symbol of something far larger, the valuation of a soul by a world that believed it could own one. Every empire runs on that belief. Every institution thrives on your silence. So, before we go deeper, understand this. Once you hear what was written on the back of that auction receipt, once you see who bought her and why, you cannot unlearn it. You will begin to see patterns where others see coincidence. You will start to question who profits from what you're allowed to remember. And that is how awakening begins. Not with light, but with the sound of a coin falling on a courthouse floor. The lie they fed you was that the South's cruelty was a product of ignorance, of men born into a world they could not see beyond. That's comforting, isn't it? To think brutality comes from blindness, from stupidity. But no, what happened that morning was not stupidity. It was calculation, cold, deliberate, and precise. Understand this, when a woman was priced at 12 cents, the number itself was the weapon. It was chosen to cut deeper than the whip, deeper than the chain, because the market of human beings ran on numbers, and numbers spoke louder than words. 12 cents told the world, she is worthless. And when the crowd believed it, her spirit was crushed before a hand even touched her. This is the essence of psychological control. Turning symbols into shackles. The three men who orchestrated the sale knew exactly what they were doing. The judge, the planter, the overseer, each played their role like actors in a ritual older than the courthouse itself. Their goal wasn't profit. It was ritual humiliation, the public stripping of dignity, until even the memory of defiance seemed absurd. But here's the truth no history book dares whisper. That courthouse wasn't a courthouse. It was a temple, and those men were priests, performing sacrifices in the name of property law. Every gavel strike was liturgy. Every signature was scripture. They weren't just enforcing the law, they were worshiping it. Now ask yourself, how different is the world you live in? When a man's worth is measured in credit scores, wages, or prison sentences, do you not see the same altar? The same ritual, the same silent temple hidden in plain sight? The woman on those steps wasn't being sold. She was being offered. Offered as a warning, offered as an example, offered to prove that even love, even life in her womb, could not outrank the power of law. Her body was the stage upon which the system displayed its absolute dominance. And here's the dark secret: the auction wasn't about her at all. It was about the man who dared to love her. A brother, a rival, a weak link in the chain of power. By reducing her to 12 cents, they weren't destroying her. They were destroying him. This is the level of cruelty the powerful understand best. To break one soul, you annihilate another. And tonight, you'll see how that same mechanism still thrives in the shadows around you. The stranger appeared like a fracture in the script. His name, Isaiah Mercer, was spoken only once that day, but it echoed like thunder through every man who stood upon those courthouse steps, because his presence was not coincidence. He wasn't supposed to exist inside their system. He didn't fit. And that terrified them. Understand what this means. Every power structure depends on predictability. The oppressor counts on obedience. The judge expects compliance, and the law feeds on repetition. The same words, the same rituals, the same verdicts. Over and over until submission becomes tradition. That morning, everything was set in motion to end in silence. But Mercer's voice broke it. 12 cents, he said. And with those 2 words, the ritual cracked. The crowd turned uncertain. The overseer froze. The judge's pen hovered. For the first time, the machine hesitated, because truth always enters quietly, never with trumpets, always with a whisper that shouldn't exist. Now imagine their minds in that instant. Who was this man? He spoke like someone who belonged, but carried himself like someone who didn't care to. His clothes were dusty from the road, but his eyes carried something dangerous. Recognition. Not of the woman alone, but of the entire performance unfolding before him. He saw through it. You see, Mercer wasn't a savior. He wasn't there out of mercy or pity. He was there because he'd seen this ritual before, hundreds of times across states and markets, where human beings were turned into currency. But this time, something about the woman, something about her story, pulled him back into the arena, not as a trader, not as a buyer, as a witness determined to rewrite the ending. By the time the auctioneer's hammer fell, and Mercer's name was inked beside hers, 7 men in that square had already made a decision. He would not leave the parish alive. Because that's how control preserves itself. It doesn't strike when you're defiant. It waits until you think you're safe. Every system of domination operates this way. It smiles while signing your freedom papers. It blesses you as you walk out the door. And when you finally exhale, it erases your name from the record. That's what this story really reveals. The moment you think you've escaped the system, you've already stepped deeper into its labyrinth. The road out of Greensburg was lined with pine and silence. The wagon creaked. The air tasted like rust and rain. For the first time, the woman, Clara, allowed herself to look at the man who had bought her. His profile was cut from something unyielding, a face that had known hunger, war, and the kind of guilt that lingers even in dreams. When he finally spoke, it wasn't the voice of a stranger. "You don't remember me," he said. Memory is a cruel thing. It hides the unbearable until something, a voice, a gesture, a word, drags it screaming back into the present. Clara's breath caught. The image came unbidden, a crowded auction yard in Richmond, the smell of iron and sweat, her mother's cries fading behind her as she was pulled away. He had been there. Not as a rescuer, but as a man working for the ones who sold her. She stared at him, fury and disbelief warring behind her eyes. "Then you're no better than them." "I was no better," Mercer replied, "until I saw what I had become." That's the part they never teach you in history. Redemption didn't exist in those days. It wasn't a virtue. It was a threat. A man who awakened to conscience in a world built on cruelty became more dangerous than a thief or a murderer because he exposed the lie that evil was inevitable. Mercer's eyes stayed on the horizon as he spoke. He had once been the machine's servant, a cog in the trade of flesh. But something inside him had broken the night he watched a child, barely old enough to walk, taken from her mother and sold for $3 to a man who owned dogs worth 10 times more. That night, Mercer stopped sleeping. He started listening. And what he began to hear was not just the cries of the enslaved, but the whispers of the system itself, the hidden code behind every transaction, every law, every sermon. It wasn't just about slavery. It was about obedience, the conditioning of generations to accept hierarchy as holy. That's what makes control eternal. It adapts its form. Chains become contracts, masters become employers, and history, when rewritten by victors, becomes the softest weapon of all. Because once the lie is sacred, truth becomes treason. In 1897, when workmen tore down the north wall of that same Louisiana courthouse, they found a single folded sheet sealed behind a brick. The paper was stiff with age, its ink brown and fading. On one side, a receipt, the sale of one female mulatto approximately 23 years of age. The date March 14, 1853. The price 12 cents, the signatures of 7 men, all pillars of the parish, names still carved on local monuments. But what froze the men holding that paper wasn't the sale. It was what was written on the back. 7 lines, each scrawled in a different hand, 7 oaths. Not of business, but of silence. By the laws of men and God, this matter shall not be spoken beyond the circle. The bloodline must remain obscured. Should it surface, all profit falls. Those lines were written by the judge, the planter, the overseer, and 4 witnesses, each binding himself to a secret that would outlive them all. Mercer had known this document existed. He had written to abolitionists in New Orleans about it, warning them that beneath the legal facade of slavery there was a second ledger, a record not of sales but of bloodlines, children born to masters, hidden in plantations, erased from inheritance, sold under false names. The true purpose of many slave auctions wasn't just labor. It was containment. The containment of scandal, of lineage, of truth that could dismantle dynasties if it ever surfaced. And Clara's unborn child was one of those buried truths. That's why her sale mattered. It wasn't a transaction. It was a burial. A ritual to erase a name that, if revealed, would expose the blood of a plantation hair flowing in the veins of someone born enslaved. 12 cents was the cost of silence. Mercer's mission wasn't redemption. It was rebellion. He wasn't trying to free Clara. He was trying to preserve the evidence of what they had done. He believed that if he could keep her and the child alive, their existence would become the single crack in the illusion of Southern nobility. That's why the courthouse men swore their oaths. That's why the record was hidden. And that's why, when that receipt was rediscovered 40 years later, the men who found it resealed the wall in terror. Because the truth didn't just threaten their ancestors, it threatened everything that still profits from their silence. The deeper Mercer traveled south, the more he understood that slavery had never been a system. It was an organism. It breathed, adapted, devoured, and evolved. Every courthouse, every church, every plantation house was one of its organs. And its blood was secrecy. The institution survived not because of whips and chains, but because of paper. Birth records altered, bills of sale rewritten, family trees pruned until their roots vanished beneath centuries of lies. By the time Mercer reached Baton Rouge, he was no longer running with Clara. He was running for her. The child she carried wasn't just hers. It was the evidence that tied generations of pure, white names to the very bodies they had bought, abused, and discarded. A single birth certificate could have shattered bloodlines, destroyed estates, rewritten inheritances. That's why the men who had sold her for 12 cents weren't merchants. They were custodians of a conspiracy. Mercer began to trace the network. The same 7 signatures appeared again and again, on church donation ledgers, cotton contracts, even cemetery deeds. Different counties, different years, but always the same pattern: a woman sold below value, a witness sworn to secrecy, and a child that vanished from all records within weeks. It wasn't commerce. It was erasure masquerading as trade. In New Orleans, Mercer found the final proof. Hidden in a parish archive was a secondary ledger, stamped with the mark of the Society of Southern Preservation. It listed payments, Not for slaves, but for silence. Payouts made to priests, clerks, and auctioneers for concealing unlawful births. Among the entries was Clara's name, and beside it, the initials of her previous owner, EPR. Those 3 letters haunted Mercer. They stood for Elias Prescott Rourke, a plantation heir whose descendants still controlled rail lines and shipping contracts decades later. That name still appears in history books as a builder of the New South. But the truth was darker. Rourke's wealth was founded not only on human labor, but on the systematic erasure of his own bloodline. Mercer realized the war had never ended. It had only changed vocabulary. The same men who once sold children into silence had become lawmakers and bankers. Their descendants still owned the land, the banks, the schools, and the story. And that's the cruelest trick of all when history is written by the victors. The crimes don't vanish, they just start to sound like progress. By the time they reached the edge of the Rourke estate, the air itself seemed to recoil. The land was vast, crawling with ghosts of men who had tilled its soil and died nameless. The mansion stood untouched, its columns bright against a sky heavy with thunder, the perfect monument to hypocrisy disguised as heritage. Mercer stopped the wagon a mile out. "This is where the story ends," he said quietly. Clara looked up at the sprawling house, the very place where her mother had been kept, beaten, and finally sold. Her voice trembled. Ends for who? That question hung between them like a blade. Mercer had spent months collecting evidence, letters, and receipts to expose the Rourke's crimes. But now, with Clara's child nearing birth, the truth was no longer just a matter of justice. It was a death sentence. Every man who had ever tried to reveal the mixed bloodlines of plantation heirs had been hunted, silenced, or disappeared. Inside the house lived Elias Prescott Rourke's widow, an aging matriarch known for her charity and her temper. Mercer had written to her once under a false name, pretending to be a genealogist. She'd replied with chilling civility, "Family is what survives documentation, not what creates it." That letter alone had convinced Mercer that her wealth was built not merely on land, but on the burial of truth. As the storm rolled in, they hid the wagon under the trees. Mercer laid out a plan to break into the Rourke archive, hidden behind the parlor walls, and retrieve the original ledger that listed the erased children. "If we can prove what they did," he told Clara, "your child will carry the truth they tried to destroy." But Clara saw beyond his obsession. She saw the cost. Truth didn't save people like her. It killed them. For her, survival was rebellion. For Mercer, exposure was redemption. And in that difference lay the tragedy of every revolution. One fought for justice, the other for breath. When night fell, Mercer moved toward the mansion with his satchel of forged papers and a pistol tucked beneath his coat. Clara watched him go, her hands trembling over her belly. Somewhere deep inside her, the child kicked, like it knew that before dawn, either the lie or the man who tried to break it would die. Midnight cloaked the Rourke estate in silence, the kind that breathes like a living thing. Mercer slipped through the servants' corridor, guided only by memory and the faint scent of old tobacco that still lingered from the overseer's quarters. Every board creaked like it remembered the footsteps of men who once carried chains instead of keys. He reached the parlor, a cathedral of southern arrogance. Oil portraits watched him from the walls, their painted eyes filled with pride and denial. Behind one of those portraits, Rourke's own, a panel concealed the archive he had come to find. Mercer pried it open, heart-pounding. Inside lay a small leather-bound book, its cover cracked, its pages yellowed. He lit a match. The first page bore a title written in steady ink, Registry of Unsanctioned Issue. Property to be contained. He flipped through the names, dozens of them, each paired with initials of the plantation father, the year, and the amount paid for silence. Some children were marked, disposed. Others, relocated. But one entry stopped his breath cold. Clara, born to Lydia, Father EPR, value concealed by order. The Clara wasn't just connected to the Rourke line. She was Rourke blood. The woman he had sworn to protect, the one sold for 12 cents, was the hidden daughter of Elias Prescott Rourke himself. That revelation changed everything. She wasn't merely a victim of the system. She was its buried heir. Mercer barely had time to close the ledger before the room filled with light. The Rourke widow stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 armed men. Her face was calm, almost tender. "You've traveled a long way, Mr. Mercer," she said. "And for what? To give a bastard a crown." The Mercer drew his pistol but didn't fire. Her words pierced deeper than any bullet. She stepped closer, her eyes cold with certainty. "You think the world wants the truth. It only wants comfort. We've learned that for 100 years. He looked past her to the portraits, the empire of ghosts, and realized she was right about one thing. The world rarely rewards the truth. It buries it in marble. Outside, thunder split the sky. Clara, waiting in the woods, saw the flash of light from the mansion's window, and knew the moment the past had finally met its reckoning. Clara did not wait for the storm to pass. She stepped from the shelter of the trees, rain slashing across her face like a baptism. The mansion glowed faintly through the downpour, its windows alive with flickering candlelight. Every step she took toward it felt heavier, weighted by the ghosts of her mother, her child, and all the nameless women whose blood had watered the soil beneath her feet. Inside, Mercer's voice echoed faintly through the marble hall. She could hear the widow's calm reply, each word precise and venomous. "You think blood will change anything?" The old woman said. "It never has. The world doesn't remember the truth, Mr. Mercer. It remembers the story." Clara pushed open the door before fear could stop her. Her dress clung to her skin, soaked through, her breath shallow but steady. The widow turned, her surprise fleeting. "Ah," she said softly, "the child returns to the house." That phrase, "the child," cut Clara deeper than any insult. It stripped her of name, of memory, of the humanity she had fought to reclaim. "You don't own me," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of centuries. "Not my mother, not my child, not even your blood." Mercer turned toward her, eyes wide, not with fear but awe. For months, he had imagined himself the one carrying the truth. In that moment, he understood she was the truth. She was the living evidence of everything the Rourkes had buried. The widow stepped closer, her expression softening with something almost maternal. "My dear," she whispered, "you could stay. We could erase the records. Protect you. Your child would never hunger." The Clara's hand rested on her belly. The storm roared louder. "That's what you call protection," she said, "hiding what you did. Pretending it never happened." A flash of lightning filled the room. The widow flinched, and in that instant, Clara saw her clearly, not as a monster, but as the last echo of a dying empire desperate to preserve its illusion. When the thunder faded, Mercer set the ledger on the table between them. "This doesn't belong to you anymore," he said. And for the first time in her life, Clara saw power shift, not with violence, but with truth spoken aloud in the house that had built its fortune on silence. The air inside the parlor thickened, every breath tasting of rain and smoke from the candles. For a moment, time itself seemed to hold still. Mercer's hand trembled slightly on the ledger. The widow's gaze flicked between him and Clara, her calm composure cracking into something colder, fear. Not fear of death, but of exposure, the kind that unravels a lifetime of lies in a single heartbeat. "You don't understand what you're doing," the widow hissed, her voice trembling now. "If this ledger leaves this house, the world will not see truth. It will see chaos. The bloodlines will collapse. The name will mean nothing." A Mercer met her eyes. Maybe that's what it should have meant all along. Nothing. She reached into her gown. The glint of a revolver caught the candlelight. Clara froze, instinctively shielding her belly. For the first time, Mercer saw not an aging matriarch, but a creature cornered by the very legacy she had worshipped. He stepped between them, gun raised. "Put it down," he said. The widow's lip curled. "You don't kill the hand that built your country," she spat. "Without us, you're nothing but ashes and memory." And then, the shot. A deafening crack that tore through the silence. Mercer staggered back, his pistol falling from his grasp. Clara screamed as he collapsed, blood spreading across his shirt like a red confession. The widow's breath came in ragged bursts, her hand shaking from the recoil. "This house will outlive all of you," she whispered. "It always does." The Clara moved before she could think. She seized the ledger, her palms slick with sweat, and hurled it into the fireplace. Flames swallowed the pages instantly. Years of secrecy, of falsified births, of names turned into debts, all burning into light. The widow lunged forward, shrieking, but Clara stood firm, her body silhouetted against the fire's glow. "This house dies tonight," she said, as the roof groaned beneath the weight of thunder, and the flames began to climb. Clara dragged Mercer toward the door. His voice, faint but steady, reached her ear. "You did it. You made them remember." Outside, the storm drenched them both. Behind them, the Rourke estate burned, a cathedral of false purity collapsing into smoke. Clara looked back only once, not in grief, but in defiance, because sometimes the only way to break a bloodline is to let it burn. By dawn, the mansion was gone. Smoke curled into a gray sky, carrying with it the last breath of the Rourke dynasty. The air reeked of ash and memory. Clara sat beneath the charred remains of an oak tree, her dress torn and soaked, her arms wrapped around Mercer's still body. He hadn't made it through the night. His eyes had stayed open until the fire reached its peak. Watching the empire of silence collapse into nothing, he had died the way he had lived, half condemned, half redeemed. The first cries came just as the sun pierced the clouds. The child was born in the mud, between the roots of that old oak place where men once hung chains and called it law. Clara's hands shook as she lifted the newborn to her chest. The baby's breath was weak but steady. She whispered a name, Mercy. It was more than a word. It was a defiance. She wrapped the infant in Mercer's coat and looked toward the ruins. From that distance, the burned pillars resembled gravestones, monuments not to power, but to all that power destroys. And in that silence, Clara understood something that no sermon, no speech, no document had ever told her. History wasn't written in ledgers or books. It was written in survival. In every woman who refused to die quietly. In every child born from forbidden blood who refused to forget. By the time the sheriff and his men arrived, there was nothing left to salvage. The widow's body was found in the ashes, her revolver melted to slag. The ledger had turned to cinders. The lawmen didn't ask questions. They just recorded another accidental fire and moved on. That's how history protects itself, by pretending not to see. Clara walked away barefoot, carrying her child through the smoke. No witnesses, no records, no proof. Only a mother and a story the world wasn't ready to hear. Years later, a teacher in New Orleans would find a nameless woman cleaning classrooms after hours. She would speak softly, carry a quiet dignity, and raise a daughter who could read. And in every word that daughter learned to write, in every page she filled with truth, a little more of that 12-cent silence died. Because some legacies are not inherited, they are rewritten, and this one began with a woman who cost less than a coin, but bought her child the world. 40 years later, the world had changed, or at least pretended to. The Rourke estate was gone, its ashes buried beneath a cotton field, now owned by a railroad company. The courthouse had been rebuilt with marble columns and a plaque that said progress. No one spoke of the fire. No one remembered the name Clara. But history never forgets. It just whispers through the blood of those who survived it. In a narrow schoolhouse outside New Orleans, a woman named Mercy Rourke, though she never used that surname, stood before a group of children reciting their lessons. Her voice was calm, her presence commanding. The townsfolk called her Miss Mercy. Unaware of the legacy she carried in her veins, she taught her students to read not just words, but meaning. Every page you write, she told them, is a wound you heal. When the last child left, she locked the door and reached into the drawer of her desk. Inside lay a small, scorched coin, blackened by fire, the edges fused. The only thing that had survived the blaze that night, the 12-cent coin. That coin had passed through hands that believed they owned her. Yet now, it belonged to no one but her. On quiet evenings, Mercy would sit by the window, listening to the cicadas hum through the Louisiana dusk. She didn't remember her mother's face clearly, only the warmth of her touch, the sound of her heartbeat against a storm. But the fire lived inside her, the inheritance no law could erase. One night, she opened an old book of scripture left by a traveling preacher. On the inside cover, she wrote a single line in her careful hand. They sold her for 12 cents, but she bought freedom with fire. That line would outlive her. It would be copied by students, quoted by writers, repeated in sermons. No one would know who wrote it, but its truth would echo through generations. Mercy died old, surrounded by her pupils, her name etched not on marble but in memory. And though no historian ever told her story, her existence itself was the proof, the final defiance. Because in the end, history is not what the powerful record, it is what the survivors remember. And the world still trembles at the memory of the woman who was once sold for 12 cents. In 2024, a graduate student named Elijah Carter was combing through digital archives at Tulane University when he stumbled upon a file mislabeled as unverified property record, St. Helena Parish, 1853. Most would have skipped it. Elijah didn't. His great-grandmother used to whisper about the woman who burned the masters. He thought it was folklore. Until that day, the scanned image showed a deed of sale, faded ink, signatures of 7 men, and the line that stopped his breathing. One female, name unrecorded. Sold for 12 cents. But that wasn't what stunned him. On the back of the parchment, faint and barely legible under ultraviolet scan, someone had written 12 words in blackened ash. Fire cleanses what law cannot. His pulse raced. He cross-referenced the date, the witnesses, the parish judge. Every thread led back to the same courthouse, the one rebuilt after the mysterious blaze that had no official record. But Elijah found something else buried in the state archive microfilm reels, a handwritten school ledger from 1889, signed by a teacher named Mercy R. The signature was small, deliberate, and beneath it, her handwriting again. They sold her for 12 cents. That night, Elijah sat alone in his apartment, the Louisiana rain tapping the windows like Morse code. His laptop screen glowed with the documents that shouldn't exist. He realized the woman his ancestors whispered about was real. Not myth, not legend. Clara. He whispered her name aloud, as if calling to the dead. The lights flickered. When he posted fragments of his discovery online, the reaction was instant. Scholars dismissed it, locals denied it, but men like you, watched in silence. Because deep down they felt it. This wasn't just about one woman. It was about what power does when no one is watching. Elijah began filming his findings. His first video ended with a challenge to his viewers. One that you're hearing right now. He looked into the camera and said, "If you've made it this far, write in the comments, 'I am the fire.' Write it twice. Once for her. Once for yourself." Within a week, the phrase flooded social feeds like a secret awakening. "I am the fire." It became a whisper in the algorithm, an oath among those who understood, because the world doesn't end when truth is forgotten. It ends when men stop seeking it. Elijah couldn't sleep after that night. Every sound, the rain on the glass, the groan of the ceiling fan, felt like a whisper from the past. He kept seeing the image of the courthouse engulfed in flames, hearing the screams that had no record, smelling smoke that no historian had ever written about. The deeper he searched, the more resistance he met. Files disappeared. Archive links broke. His university login was suddenly under review. He'd crossed a line, and he knew it. But he couldn't stop. Because Clara's story wasn't just a tragedy. It was a message deliberately buried by those who feared what she represented. In a private collection held by the Louisiana Historical Society, Elijah found something few had ever seen: a half-burned diary, its edges blackened. The archivist said it had no known author, but the first line was unmistakable. "If they call this justice, then let the world burn with me." Elijah's breath caught. The handwriting matched Mercy's. The pages that followed described not just the fire, but the ritual behind it. Clara had waited until midnight, when the men slept drunk on power and brandy. She lit each room in silence, starting with the overseer's quarters, then Duncan's house. But in the final entry, written in trembling strokes, Mercy, her daughter, wrote one sentence that changed everything Elijah thought he knew. He wasn't her master, he was her mirror. It wasn't about revenge. It was transformation. Clara hadn't burned for hatred. She burned for purification. For every generation that would come after, her act became more than rebellion. It became a symbolic cleansing, the soul reclaiming what ownership tried to erase. When Elijah shared that final page online, his video was deleted within an hour. Copyright claim. Historical disinformation. But by then, it was too late, because thousands had already downloaded it. And thousands more had written those same 3 words beneath every post that followed: "I am the fire." It spread like a secret code, men sharing it not as defiance, but as remembrance. Not of a woman sold for 12 cents, but of what she did with the flames she carried inside. And somewhere in that digital storm of voices, Elijah realized she wasn't gone, she had just changed form. Elijah stared at the screen, the glow reflecting in his eyes, heart hammering. The final page of Mercy's diary burned in his memory. He wasn't her master, he was her mirror. At first, he thought it was metaphor, a commentary on the cruelty of men who replicate the system that enslaved them. But as he traced the signatures, the ledger entries, the scattered records, a darker truth emerged. The mirror wasn't just a metaphor. It was literal. He saw patterns in the bloodlines, marriages, and inheritances. Men who had claimed to own control and a race. Many were direct descendants of his own family. Men whose silence had protected wealth, power, and law. Men whose complacency had allowed Clara's suffering and Mercy's survival to exist in the shadows. Elijah's hands shook. The fire that had purified the past now reflected on him. He had been drawn into the story not by chance, but by inheritance. Every document he'd uncovered, every digital ledger, every archival photograph was pointing to the same revelation. He was standing in the same chain of command, the same bloodline, the same moral mirror that Clara had confronted decades ago. The 12-cent woman had not only survived, she had built a legacy that waited for someone who could see it. And that someone was him. He realized what the fire had always been: a test. Not of strength, not of courage, but of awareness. The women who had lived, burned, and remembered had designed a path for those who could recognize the machinery of power, secrecy, and complicity. To see the truth was to inherit responsibility. To speak it aloud was to become part of the cleansing. Elijah leaned back. His pulse slowed as clarity filled the room. The ledger, the diary, the ashed-marked coin, they were more than relics. They were instructions. And the algorithm, the viral code, the echo of "I am the fire." Through the internet, it was the modern flame, carrying her act into every mind willing to recognize the mirror. He looked directly into the camera, recording a final video. They sold her for 12 cents. They tried to erase her. But now we see. If you watch this, if you feel it, understand the fire is in you. Every injustice you witness, every lie you uncover, every silence you refuse, that is your inheritance. And it begins now. Elijah ended the recording. He didn't know who would watch it, who would listen, who would carry the fire forward. But he did know one thing: history never dies. It waits. And some legacies born in ash and rebellion are eternal. The mirror had been held up, and now it reflected him.